Hello there. I'm so glad you came, because I was just itching to have a conversation of Star Wars. My name is Cademan David. Welcome to the Sci-Fi Academia YouTube channel. And how are you today? So I think sometimes in the modern day, we forget just how influential Star Wars is. And part of the reason I say this, I've never existed in a post-Star Wars world, as well as, most people at this point probably have never existed in a world where Star Wars didn't. But I think prior to Star Wars, this sort of science fiction-y, more family-friendly sort of action film, I just don't think that necessarily existed, at least never to the extent Star Wars took it to. And it's just interesting to think about in a world where we never got Star Wars, would we get things like the MCU? I think where Star Wars isn't necessarily my favorite series, it's not my favorite world or anything like that, I do have a fondness for Star Wars, of course, sort of a nostalgic fondness, as well as recently I sort of rediscovered sort of a philosophical intrigue in Star Wars, where I realized that George Lucas did ingrain a lot of philosophy of both Christianity and Buddhist philosophy, which I think is really cool and really interesting to look at it from that angle. I'm just sort of left to think because a lot of the things that I do really love, more than I love Star Wars, do have certain inspirations clearly tracking back to Star Wars, right? I think Doctor Who has taken a lot of inspiration from Star Wars. Now, I know that the original, Doctor Who does predate Star Wars, but, later Doctor Who episodes, I think, have taken a lot of inspiration from Star Wars, as well as, the before-mentioned MCU and stuff like that. It's just interesting to think about, what if Star Wars never was? What if George Lucas never created Star Wars? And I think that's something interesting to think about because, much like Lord of the Rings has created and recreated the fantasy genre, I think, the books obviously creating an era of fantasy, and then after that, the Peter Jackson trilogy sort of renewing the fantasy genre, if you will, sort of presenting Lord of the Rings in the fantasy genre as a whole as, something that we can get into in the modern day. But much in the same way that Lord of the Rings has done that for the fantasy genre, I feel like Star Wars has done that for the science fiction genre, particularly the space opera side of the science fiction genre. So I guess it's just interesting to think, if Star Wars had never come around, I feel like we would still have science fiction. Would we still have that same type of science fiction? That sort of space western, right? Star Wars was originally pitched as a space western, and Star Trek, which was around the same time, if I'm not mistaken. You are mistaking past me, at least a little bit. in between the first episode of Star Trek coming out and A New Hope coming out, there is 11 years. So, actually, Star Trek would actually be coming out closer to Doctor Who in reality. But, nonetheless, even though they did come out sort of far apart, I think there is still something to be said about how those two franchises kind of, played off of each other and also developed sort of opposite sides of the sort of space opera genre. Star Wars and Star Trek, I would say, are two big pillars of the sort of modern space opera science fiction, which I think is my favorite genre of science fiction. So, all that being said, my thinking is if we didn't have Star Wars, would something else take its place? Right? Would Doctor Who get as good as Star Wars? Or rather, as big as Star Wars? I don't know. I would be interested in living in that world where, Doctor Who was more, I guess, prominent than it is today. Or was more prominent sooner, which made it more relevant as a whole. Because I feel like in a lot of the reasons Star Wars is still so prevalent to this day is because it is such a historical piece of fiction. I'm just thinking, would something else come in and fill that space? Doctor Who would be cool. With Star Trek, which is probably the most likely option, to be honest, would Star Trek be bigger if it didn't have to sort of share that space with Star Wars? Because I feel like it's really interesting the relationship that Star Trek and Star Wars have, and this could be a video in of its own, probably. But because previously mentioned, they both share sort of the space western type genre, which I think prior to Star Trek and Star Wars, the sort of more family-friendly action film was largely westerns. Again, I wasn't alive at this time, but looking back as well as talking to old people, that's sort of the vibe I understand, is that what, has become the sort of space opera / superhero genre now, it did start out as being westerns largely. So I think that's interesting. But I'm sort of getting away from myself because my original point was that they also have that, but they also have philosophy. Both Star Trek and Star Wars are largely about philosophy more than anything else. Where, Star Wars is a little bit more of a circus, there's a little more eye candy involved, I would say. It's sort of less explicitly philosophy. But, again, this is something that I sort of discovered and fell in love with about Star Wars more recently, is that, when you look at it, it is really clear George Lucas was sort of a philosophical thinker, which is very cool. And it's very cool that, sort of philosophical sort of thinker, actually did, shape so much of pop culture to this day, and I think that's really fun. But yeah, would Star Trek sort of move into the more action-based, more sort of eye candy-esque role that Star Wars plays if we didn't have Star Wars. You know, it's like, on the one hand, it's sort of a pointless conversation because we have to just sit back and say, well, we don't know. But on the other hand, it is just interesting for me to think about. But I would be happy to know, like, what do you think the implications of a modern day would be where Star Wars was never made? Right? I know my life would look much different, again, because where Star Wars does, like, sort of play a role in shaping who I am today, it's really the things that were inspired by Star Wars that I feel like have really left a huge impact on me. So yeah, you know, if you have thoughts about this, I would love to hear it in the comment section below. And if you like talking about Star Wars, I'll link my Star Wars playlist right up there. I'll link Star Trek right underneath it. And of course, subscribe to the channel for videos on science fiction and sort of philosophical, you know, lots of just random tangents. If you like tangents about, like, sort of the science fiction world, I think you'll enjoy the other stuff that I've been putting out on my channel.